So we have a really fantastic panel spearheaded by Sandrine Dixson-Declève. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing your name correctly. It's really an honor to have you here on board.
Thank you.
She's the co-president of the Club of Rome. So I'm incredibly excited for what you can share with us, especially in terms of how we can use the current crisis to develop better international policies and cooperation there. I think you've done fantastic work, especially on climate destabilization. It's an honor to have you here. Thank you so much for joining. In a second, when we're going to go into this first question, I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit more about your general efforts and how they have shifted with the current crisis. But thanks for joining. Next one up, we have Ruth Hickin, who I've had, unfortunately, only the chance to meet once in person. That was really just before COVID got bad, and we were like spearheading or like at least discussing a few opportunities to collaborate a little bit further. I'm so happy that we now get to do that online. So thank you so much for joining from the World Economic Forum and from the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution specifically. It's really a pleasure to have you here. Welcome, Ruth.
Thank you.
Awesome. Next one up, we have Michael Vassar, who I think I've been collaborating with on like some foresight and some non-foresight related projects very loosely for a while now, and I think it's really nice to have you on board here. It was a very spontaneous move this morning, but I think you're working on a project that I think is really one of the prime examples right now. If we're actually talking about how can we use current openings and national and international policies to push for good ideas. I think yours is the prime example that is doing that on a very effective, active, and currently running iteration. So it's really nice to have you here. I'm super excited.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm very excited that we can talk. Like actually work on the ground and connecting that to the larger national and international level. So that's very exciting. And then last one up, we have Sam Hilton. Sam, it's so good to see you. I'm going to unmute you too. I think we haven't had the chance yet to actually meet in person, but I'm really happy that as I was reaching out to people to kind of pull this event together, how many other people got recommended to me. And I think if I understand correctly, I mean, you're working on a host of different projects, but I think related to this, even as a scenario modeling based effort, and trying to get policymakers to think a little bit in terms of scenarios so that we're not only prepping for the next pandemic, but for a variety of different future pandemics too. And you do just really quite fantastic work, have written a ton of really good articles and blog posts on this. And I will share a few here in the chat. So thank you so much for joining. It's really nice to have you here.
Thank you.
All right, great. So without much further ado, I definitely want to dive right into it. So I would love to hear from our panelists a little bit more, like specifically about, just kind of like bringing us up to speed on like, maybe in like 1 or 2 minutes, just like what have you been working on before COVID hit and how has your work pivoted lately due to COVID-19? So kind of diving into projects that are related to that right away. And perhaps Sandrine, you'd like to start us off?
Sure, it'd be a pleasure. And hello from Rixensart, south of Brussels, even though I grew up in Palo Alto. So it feels a bit strange because I'm sure many of you are from my previous community, and I don't know how many of you are from my current community in Europe. But what can I say except that the Club of Rome has been working on these issues for the last 50 years, and that already Donella Meadows in 1972, when she was one of the co-authors of The Limits to Growth, indicated that there would never be one singular crisis, but there will always be a series of crises. And so interestingly enough, as the first female president of the Club of Rome, it took 50 years for a woman to actually become president of the Club of Rome, even though Donella Meadows did most of the initial work. I think it's really interesting to see that already 2 years ago, with myself and a few members, we published, first of all, the Climate Emergency Plan and then the Planetary Emergency Plan. And that thinking came from a request, actually, from the Secretary General of the UN and also the Potsdam Institute to work together on looking at the convergence of the tipping points that we were looking at the time. So just think about this. This is a year ago. We were looking at people, planet, and prosperity, and the convergence of the biodiversity and the climate crisis. Little did we know that actually we would get a zoonotic disease, which was clearly coming out of the infringement of people on the planetary boundaries and the way in which we look at nature and we deal with animals. So it's been quite an interesting journey, because when we go back to our planetary emergency plan that was launched at the UN actually in September, which very clearly already indicated that we were in a deep crisis and a deep emergency, and that the only way to emerge more resilient would be to look at the people, planet, prosperity issues together and to unpack the tensions between them. We then found ourselves, obviously in Europe, but in China sooner, in the COVID crisis already by the end of last year. And now the only way that I would say COVID has changed our narrative is that it's made it stronger. It's made it more urgent. The discussion, however, has to shift to emerging from emergency. And so the work that we are fundamentally doing now with our planetary emergency partnership of 280 governments, organizations, and citizen groups from across the globe, as well as academic institutes, is to look at what is the analysis that demonstrates that we can actually emerge from emergency better. We can be more resilient by looking at the current tipping points, bringing in conditionality in all of our bailouts, as well as conditionality in terms of our recovery and fiscal stimulus plans, and looking very closely at the link with health. And so I guess just the only missing link, and the community that hasn't been brought in enough to this discussion, has been the health community and the medical community. And in that sense, we're bringing them in to really combine this effort together to, as I said, talk about what are the next steps to emerge from emergency and how can we become more resilient. Maybe I'll just make one last point as a bit of a joke, but I think that we're all suffering from Zoomatica. I have sciatica now from sitting on my ass too much and Zoom calls. Every single international meeting that I was supposed to participate has been canceled until 2021. Our COP26, so that's climate COP, has been probably postponed until end of 2021. And the biodiversity COP has been postponed at least until March, April 2021. So one of the big issues and the fallouts from this is going to be governance, international governance. How do we get our voices heard? How do we ensure actually that governments come together to make the right decisions?
All right. Well, yeah, I definitely resonate with all the different Zoom ways. I think, you know, like there's, I think, cascading ways of this. But you know, I think that I'm really honored that you're for this Zoom call. I do think that we're growing like quite a neat community, and I think many of you have joined for like 8 weeks now, and it's hopefully not getting boring yet. Let's see what the next iteration will bring. But for now, I would love to welcome Ruth. Ruth, how has your work shifted due to COVID-19?
I mean, I just want to start by saying how much I appreciate the plant that is sort of haloing your head right now, Alison. It's great. I need to get one of those for myself as well. So I work for the World Economic Forum, Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolutions. And for anyone on the call who doesn't have an awareness of that, the forum is the international organization for multi-stakeholder cooperation, obviously most well known for our annual meeting in Davos each year. But we also have centers in San Francisco, Mumbai, Tokyo, and all over the world focused specifically on technology governance, which from our perspective is the regulation of technology to enable all the societal benefits and manage all of the inherent risks with emerging tech. So in one sense, the forum has completely pivoted in the last few months to work on COVID response and set up a COVID response platform supporting industry and government to tackle the crisis through a number of different means. And that's a huge new effort. But for where I work at the center, much of the content of what we do really hasn't changed, because I mean, now, you know, technology is obviously being touted as a ton of different potential solutions to the pandemic, anything from contact tracing to chatbots for health. And I think what's just interesting from our perspective is that COVID has really helped contextualize technology governance in a way that is much more understandable. So helping to explain that if we had better data governance mechanisms in place, we could have a more rapid response to the crisis through healthcare interventions, as well as contact tracing, as well as supply chain management. It really helps kind of contextualize it a lot more. So in many ways, what we're doing isn't different, although we are very much shifting the focus to support people in the sort of recovery phase. And then much more going forward, we're now moving more towards what the forum is calling the Great Reset. So the world is going to be very different, and it already is extremely different. And within this new context, we will have to harness technology more, but we have to do that in an ethical and responsible way to maximize the benefit, but manage risks, and then also avoid all of the potential inequalities that it could exacerbate. So part of it is recovery, and our big focus now is much more on the reset. And then, of course, I think, like all of us, we are moving from being a largely driven by physical events organization to a largely driven by virtual events organization. So we're trying to figure out how to engage multi-stakeholder communities online as well.
Yeah, echo that, definitely. All right, thank you. Sam, do you want to have a go?
Hi there. So the main thing I've been working on over the last year is coordinating a group in the UK Parliament to think about future generations and future risks. So insofar as I'm trying to engage people in UK politics to think about risks, not a huge amount has changed. We were running events on pandemic preparedness in 2018, and then in January this year, we did another one on biosecurity. So this is a topic that comes up quite a lot. But we started a new, there's obviously been some immediate coronavirus response, getting people who are thinking about how best to respond to the immediate situation in touch with the right people in government and in Parliament. But the main thing that we've done differently is to start a new work stream specifically looking at risk preparedness in light of the current situation. So how does the UK manage risks? How does the globe manage risks? Are we prepared for worst case scenarios? Are we prepared for like unlikely events or things that might come out of the blue? Can we even prepare for these kind of things? And what would a good mechanism to do this look like? And the more we dig into this, the more it seems that the UK did not necessarily have good mechanisms for preparation. There's evidence that our sort of pandemic preparedness in the UK was sort of set at what was manageable for the healthcare system to deal with rather than at what the actual risk was, and was based on past experience and didn't account for new and emerging diseases. So this is an issue we're trying to raise as much as possible. And it's beyond just pandemics. So I had an article today in the Telegraph which said that if the only response to the globe is to, from this pandemic in terms of risk, is to better prepare for coronavirus type diseases or zoonotic diseases or even for pandemics, then we're kind of missing the point. Like, we need to be able to predict the next disaster that's going to come along. And I think right now, there's a huge opportunity to be shaping national and international forums for risk and disaster preparedness. And that's really where we're focusing some of our research and efforts at the minute.
Okay, neat. I can't wait to hear more about that. It definitely kind of like is a really nice segue from yesterday's conversation where we talked about sense making. And, you know, we already there talked about, you know, how can we make sure that we're not just prepping for the previous pandemic. And meanwhile, Kim Osborne, who we had there, who was previously working with the DoD, NATO, and other organizations, she said it's already good that, like, in the army, apparently they have the saying that, you know, like, you always prepare for the last war. You know, so at least you're taking some things and preparing a little bit better for the next one. But there's definitely, I think, a lot of room to grow. And I'm curious to hear more about specific efforts in that area that you're doing. For now, I want to welcome Michael, if you want to give us a quick update on how your work has changed due to COVID-19.
All right, so my work tends to be associated with getting nanotechnology and industrial production systems running well. And when COVID came out, we did a lot of things related to that relatively quickly. We did a lot of optimization of Illumina devices, but we also started doing new projects that weren't similar to what we'd done previously. We started optimizing ultraviolet LED production. We started producing CPAP, BPAPs that were we used, in fact, on our CEO, and when he had COVID, and which produced a very satisfactory resolution fairly quickly. And basically, we expanded outward in technology, trying to fill all of the large gaps that we were hearing about. And what we discovered was that there was weird enough barriers to distributing tests and to distributing masks that we made the correct generalization, which was about a systematic problem of moral crisis throughout our society and basically total market failure due to total moral depravity. And in light of that, I at least made a very strong shift to optimizing virtue signaling and trying to, as directly as possible, oppose depravity rather than opposing COVID in the way that most worked with COVID. So we noticed that there was a problem in prisons all of the time, a very, very severe one. And a bunch of people I knew were talking about what we should do on a variety of domains. A friend of mine brought up the prisons thing, and we all pretty quickly oriented around, yep, that's the thing. That's the thing that will produce the maximum level of concreteness in order to create a credible signal that can get signal boosted with the right indicators of trust, which are what we need in order to get through the barriers to getting tests out, the barriers to getting masks out, etc. So we spent $100K to ship masks to 4 different prisons, got it through, and pretty quickly got matched by another $37K. Ended up distributing 137,000 prisons about a month ago. Got that discussed on Oprah, on her home show, got a total of 100 billion media clicks on various downstream media. And a few days ago, the Reform Alliance, the organization that we did this through, put 10 million more masks in prisons, which seems to be the first response that's approximately commensurate with the scale of the problem. And now we're trying to get other sanitary improvements, soap, things like that, into prisons. But we're also putting up a website that's coming up today called Redeemed Soul. That's REDEAMEDSOLE, not SOUL. We're checking through the website. It's going to have a wide range of other prison reform related options, nonprofits from extremely professional to extremely non-professional, but actual prisoners who are part of the network that got these masks into the prisons believe have been helpful for other people within their network.
All right.
So,
well, yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, well, I think, I'm hoping that we can share the website as soon as it's up in the follow-up here, because it's definitely, I think, an effort that is currently just ramping up. I'm currently trying to search for Shaka's appearance on Oprah. I think it was really quite fantastic. So I'll share that in the chat in a second. I think, now that we're kind of up to speed on okay, what has individually shifted for you? I would love to kind of dive deeper a little bit into that. And the question that I'm posting into the channel right now is, what do you think that, from the experience of your work really are the most promising policy opportunities that have unexpectedly opened up right now because of COVID-19? And you can tackle that either on a national or on an international level, depending on, where your focus lies. So I'd love to, really talk specifics. And maybe we can go the other way around. Michael, do you want to continue, and then we go around?
All right. So there's a very obvious policy opportunity in the current situation. The US has been in a sort of undeclared war in Korea for an entire lifetime at this point. And this would be a great opportunity to have an unconditional surrender to South Korea, given their superior successes in handling COVID, we could also unconditionally surrender to Denmark. But we're like in an extremely good situation right now to acknowledge that we have zero state capacity and that there exist other states that do still have some state capacity. And in the case where we're faced with a pandemic, it would be really great to be occupied and have a state with some actual state capacity implement contact tracing and other capabilities. Now, personally, I think culturally we're a better match for Denmark, but it doesn't really matter. And the great thing about this is it's the ultimate third-party pitch. If you're going to try to like run on a third party, you can't possibly have a complex enough policy yet to be credible. But once the main parties have adequately destroyed their credibility, which they have, and the non-partisan parts of the government have also adequately destroyed their credibility, we can start to getting to work to like, being a country again.
All right, well, that is quite ambitious, I think, but here we are.
It's unconditional surrender. It's the least ambitious of all policies.
For sure, yeah. In some respect, that's definitely true. Do you have anything on a national level that you think is now opening up? I mean, the prison, I think, reform thing. Maybe you could share a little bit about, why do you think it's a promising opportunity to push for that now?
So in the prison case, we have death camps. And once we've established that we're the baddies and that we have death camps, fixing the death camps seems to be the canonically correct thing to do. We have like some death camps that are labeled as specifically targeting other ethnicities, other nationalities, like those run by ICE, but you also, immigration. But we also have generic ones that just happen to be extremely racially and nationally biased, and we can do what we can to shut those death camps down too. We have way more people in incarceration than any other country, and all of our incarceration services totally flagrantly violate the law. They totally flagrantly violate all policies, and they do it with more or less total impunity. There was a great successful whistleblower lawsuit on the behalf of the California prisoners in the last year, where they were sued for over 20 years not providing mental health and saying that they were providing mental health. And there was a protest that involved a prisoner plucking out and eating their own eye, which got some attention and brought things down to a court ruling to actually push for supervision, I believe, of their claims to have mental health, to provide mental health services. So the prisons are kind of under siege in a really useful way. It's good timing. Basically, we can be trying to fight against entropy in life, or we can be trying to fight against evil. And like usually fighting against evil is useless because you don't have very good evidence about what you're doing. But when you find situations where extremely rudimentary attempts to fight entropy are failing left, right, and sideways, whether it's distribution of masks or distribution of tests, then you don't really have any choice but to turn to fighting evil. And so you want to like target the thing that will draw the most clear illegal response from the general patterns that are responsible for criminality throughout society. I mean, you could do this with #MeToo too. We could have used the Jeffrey Epstein suicide as the basis for a massive movement towards prison reform. But this works even better.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I know from like personal information that definitely everything that the BOP is claiming that they're doing as response to COVID-19, I mean, I would say about 60 to 70% are blatant lies. And in many cases, they actually do the exact opposite of what they're claiming on the website. For example, they claim they have installed social distancing as much as possible. What they've actually done is disallow prisoners to go outside. So they're now locked in 300 people in one room. So that's kind of the opposite. They're moving people around the whole time from A to B, to kind of like distill the worker bees that are needed to get the medium prison facilities run from the old and sick. People go into quarantine, then they get pulled out just like 2 days before they would have completed it. With quarantine, I mean solitary confinement. So they're now back to zero. And the crazy thing is that the BOP actually published a thing called, I think the BOP's stance on misinformation to kind of like rectify what the misinformation that's out about the BOP. But most of the things that they were saying, that they were claiming that they weren't doing on the while trying to rectify the misinformation that's out about them, that is actually totally what they're doing. So I think one really interesting thing is that on Friday there's actually, I think, a law that is that may be passed, or at least that's being discussed. And in that law, it basically said the information that the POP is providing about the current situation inside of the prison appears to be not correct. And so I think that not correct is like a really interesting, I think, legal way of saying like, well, they've just kind of blatantly lied. But yeah, I think I wanna give it out to our other panelists too. I think, you know, this is definitely a national, I think, hotspot of attention, but perhaps you could throw some others in the mix there. Maybe who do we go next with? Sam, I can't see you right now. Then
Hello.
Oh yeah, great, there you are.
Hi there. So in the UK at the minute, I can't talk about the US. I don't really know what it's like, but in terms of UK politics right now, firstly, everything is coronavirus, COVID related. It's like dominated the political agenda. And this means that if you're doing other stuff, it's hard to get attention right now. But after it's all dealing with the immediate situation, which is what's going on now, then there'll be a stage of how did we manage to mess this up so bad, assuming we have messed it up, which I think is currently what it's looking like. And then there will be a stage of like, how are we going to put the pieces back together? And across all of these, policy development is moving 10 times as fast. So whatever area of policy you're interested in, you can have an effect on, almost certainly, on that area of policy within the next year or two, and a much larger effect than you might have had otherwise, because this current situation is shaking everything up so much. So in practice, this means for people interested in trying to change policy, think about like the areas of policy where you have some relevant expertise and where you think it's particularly important to focus on. So for me, this is largely on this risk management side of things, which I think is a really important thing for the world to get right. And then think about like the timing of this. So like, how can you work to like, how is coronavirus affecting this area of policy? And it is affecting everything. It's affecting policy on like domestic abuse because people are at home more. It's affecting prisons. It's affecting food banks. It's affecting employment policy. It's affecting welfare policy. So like, what's important to focus on, risk management or anything else, and then the timing. And you can start working on these areas right now. The top decision makers are very busy, but the other people in like Parliament, the people who like aren't in the current government, the backbench MPs in the UK, have some capacity now to be thinking about like, what's this next step? There's work that can be done on drafting like policy proposals. There are civil servants who are like desperately trying to like pull everything together for their policy areas and completely lacking in the sort of time needed to come up with credible plans for how to reshape the education system, given that universities won't necessarily be having the same amount of foreign students and income from that way, and all these kind of like random little policy questions. So that's sort of the policy shaping advice that I would like give to people, is that like, now is the time to be doing stuff, and start thinking about talking to people now and developing the suggestions and the timing when it should come out. And so for me, this means that I'm putting a bunch of time now into talking to backbench MPs, members of the House of Lords, about risk management. We put in a request for a review of risk management. We're doing some of our own research on like what good risk management processes should be at a national level. And I want to also do this kind of stuff at an international level. Potentially like academic collaborations around the world could be a demonstrative tool for actual political collaborations further down the line. And if we can get those academic collaborations happening now on how countries should work together better on risks, and reports published saying the same thing in different countries, then in 6 months or 12 months, whenever countries start saying, how did we get this so wrong, this information will be there, there'll be people teed up to say about it. So that's sort of the direction I'm taking it. But you could do this with other areas as well. So my sort of advice and how I'm doing it.
Wow, okay, that's great. I mean, if you have a laundry list of like specific either items or specific kind of like addresses that people should be focusing on there, that would be amazing. I know that you've written a lot, and I'm going to share the other article that you wrote on specific opportunities, at least for the UK, also in the chat here. Okay, Ruth.
Yeah. Well, I will. The perspective I bring to this is obviously more around the technology governance side of things, but there are, I think, some really significant opportunities that have been brought to light in the wake of the pandemic. And the first is really what I alluded to briefly before, is around data. So I think we all know that there's different figures out there, but something like 1.5 quintillion megabytes of data produced per day, which is largely unuseful in its current form. And that's for a few reasons. It's either it exists in silos, and those might be from privacy perspectives or from kind of business model side of things, but there is an opportunity for governments and industry to come together to think about data for common purposes. So what I mean by that is that if you can aggregate data in a way that still maintains privacy, but enables you to use AI to draw interesting results from it, you can use it for better societal outcomes. And that might be, that's precision agriculture, that's ocean preservation, but in this particular context, it's healthcare data. So we know that there's a significant amount of healthcare data that exists in the world today that is living in silos in people's healthcare records, in people's Fitbits, in their own kind of health monitoring apps. And there are good reasons why that exists in a private way. But if you do create good governance around it and you do use a federated data system, you can pull that data together and get better insights. And if we have more global cooperation around data for common purposes, then we can have a huge amount of societal benefit. And then tied to that, which is a concept which is really, really nascent that we're working on, is this notion of a data marketplace, which is that in the same way that when an artist sells their music and gets residual value every time it's played, our data is being used and giving residual value to private sector companies or government. But imagine a world in which you could charge Facebook $1 for using your data, but offer to donate your data for free for better healthcare outcomes. So they may exist in small pockets, but what we're looking at the forum is a much more global cooperation and data across borders. So that's one interesting, potentially game-changing application. The other is around supply chains, and I think that the coronavirus exposed weaknesses in supply chain systems in very significant ways. So organizations have shown varying degrees of ability to respond, but really just, even if you just look at the supply and demand of masks, and now all of us have become home mask makers. I don't know about everyone else on this call, but I certainly had to get my sewing machine out in a way that I hadn't done for a long time. But we do need to think through better interconnected and interoperable supply chains that can respond better to this. And you can use technology like blockchain to allow for transparent systems to be in place that incentivize everyone in the ecosystem to collaborate with each other. Then thirdly, and sorry, I don't want to take up too much time, but the other piece is around technology infrastructure. So accelerating the development and deployment of new infrastructure like 5G networks and data centers is a big priority for China in the light of the COVID response. And that should be the same for a lot of countries here. I mean, in COVID-19, we've seen remote working policies get into place, but there are still millions, 21 million people in America lack access to broadband. So connectivity should be a major policy priority to help people respond. And I think there are many companies that are not planning on opening their offices in anytime soon. Twitter just announced a fully remote working policy this morning. And then I think,
Last night, actually.
Last night, okay, thank you.
I didn't know, I thought it was muted.
Thanks for the correction. So maybe it was this morning, San Francisco time. And then, yeah, I think remote working policies and access to technology are two other big pieces.
Oh, neat. Okay, that's also quite the laundry list there. Oh my God, I can't wait until I'm going to go through the transcript and literally go bit by bit for the follow-ups. Sandrine, we'd love to hear from you as well.
I'm having an amusing time, I must say, in the chat. I would actually say that what hasn't really been mentioned, although there's been some really interesting thinking that's coming out, is the fact that we haven't talked at all about the big systems changes that are possible post-COVID. And that's where I actually think we're going to have the greatest shift. And that starts with, first of all, an opening of consciousness that this is the greatest experiment we've ever seen globally. And I think that if we're able to make people realize as they come out of COVID, what actually is essential and what are core value systems, then we will both through citizen empowerment, but also through governments be able to shift policies. It's not happening right now. The recovery plans, as I said, are still very much going back to business as usual. But what we are seeing is some key shifts, at least I've been talking about in the chat, around the uptake of well-being economy models. The looking at the donut economic model, which was proposed by one of our members, Kate Rayworth, and also growth or limited growth, more looking at prosperity as a replacement of growth and well-being. All of these discussions, at least in many European circles, are incredibly ripe, and they are also in parts of Asia. And I think that if we're able to seize that, both at the international level as well as at the national level, then we'll see some real concrete policy changes. How is that shifting concretely already now? Well, we can look at sustainable finance, for example, and the discussions that we're seeing with Carney, who was previously at the Bank of England. The push that he made around stress testing and net zero balance sheets and the need to actually integrate value-based finance across most of the multilateral development banks, the central banks, and most of our finance system is now completely resonating, both in terms of social implications as well as environmental implications. And that is actually the conversations that I'm partaking in also with the German government and other governments is really starting to resonate. The problem is, and this is where we're very much starting to shift the thinking around the COVID exit, recovery, rebuilding, and resilience, is that we're in the exit focus. And within the exit focus, it's survival. And even when you have people like Kristalina Georgieva, who is actually the head of the IMF, or Christine Lagarde at the ECB, the European Central Bank, making statements that actually no money will be given unless it's based on conditionality. So ensuring that actually the system is shifting towards decarbonization and that it's not just propping up oil and gas and aviation and business as usual. On the one hand, they make these statements, and then on the other hand, often we see the loans are still going to traditional bailouts, to the aviation sector without any conditions. And we saw exactly the same thing just happened this week to Costa Rica, or last week, where actually 500 million was given from the IMF to Costa Rica, just after Kristalina had made her public declaration that they would be the bridge to recovery. And that 500 million had no strings attached. And the finance minister grabbed it, told the environment minister, who's a friend, you're not going to have any of this. And we're basically just going to bail out those ailing companies that are predominantly tied to the old economy. So I think what we're seeing is we're still not totally into that. How do we shift that consciousness that we feel is the right consciousness? The fact that we're starting to see that actually essential workers in the real economy are not the ones that we thought they were, like bankers and investors, and that actually they're health workers and nurses, and therefore we need to protect these essential jobs. We know that's a reality. Actually going into that area and really shifting policy to reflect that is not yet happening on the ground. I'm still hopeful that it will. And maybe the last point I'll make is that the biggest policy shift as well that could be incredibly important and that's not yet happening, but it's starting to really resonate across most nation states. And that is, what do we do with those that are outside the real economy? What do we do with artists? How do we ensure that actually our policies enable culture and the continuation of culture and art? How do we ensure that our policies enable small and medium-sized enterprises rather than just propping up multinationals? Because all those great creative solutions that Michael talked about are predominantly being done actually by small and medium-sized enterprises or individuals who have stepped up to the plate and are trying to make a difference. And yet, on the one hand, we're still propping up the large multinationals that are predominantly going to give the money to their shareholders. So I think that there's a lot of hope that the policy can shift. It has to shift much more towards a bigger systems approach. And in some cases, we're seeing that in some economies, but not necessarily across the board.
Yeah,
Maybe one last point on policy is vaccines. I mean, we haven't talked about access to vaccines, but I find it despicable what's happening in the United States. And apologies for, I mean, I did grow up in the States. I do have American citizen, but I do think that Americans have lost the plot. Not all, but clearly the fact that, again, we're creating a vaccine war between labs, and we're going to once again be promoting the profit motive overall when we know that we are as vulnerable as the weakest link, and in particular in COVID. And that really frightens me that we haven't yet, in parts of the US, understood this very important fact, that it is not just me, myself, and I, and my individual right to do whatever I damn well please that should actually enable me to be a citizen in the United States or in the world.
Yeah, I mean, we had a few vaccine efforts on actually at previous salons, and they've given us a little bit of like a look behind the scenes, and it's utterly insane the way that money is distributed and the way that it's just a totally nuts process. I can share like a few links to videos there, but like, I mean, really conspiracy ripe theories about how people are kind of like trying to game the system to get their vaccines in there versus others, how some are shunned from actually like doing development on like life-saving technologies. It's really quite insane. Okay, well, this is really quite the laundry list. I think I would love to kind of like, I mean, all of you I think have mentioned this kind of greater problem of like, kind of like we know that things are on fire, and the risk is that we're not holding the right people accountable. After this, and you've already touched on this, Sandrine. It's already happening right now. People are just grabbing money as they can. So do you maybe want to kind of like say a few things about like ways that we can prep for now that won't happen again? And maybe Michael, you start, and then we circle around, and then I'll take questions. And if you could keep the answer very short, so we can go to participants as well. But like, what are the risks around this, right? If we don't gear up, who's not being held accountable, and what can people do right now to shift that?
So I think the biggest single risk associated with COVID actually is probably just the declining oil price and sudden loss of oil revenues by, in particular, Russia, when they still have 6,000 hydrogen bombs. But I don't think that's on topic right now. I want to get back to Sandrine's talk about me, myself, and I. So I think that, Sandrine, I think you and I probably agree that people would be much happier and would greatly prefer to approach life from a much more us cooperating perspective. And I think we also agree that such a perspective would be much more effective at building vaccines, that a every man for itself approach to herd immunity is not a feasible thing, and every man for himself approach to medical science is not a feasible thing. So on the other hand, if you imagine the situation of someone who is, for instance, in a prison, if they're going to survive, if they're going to ever get out, they're probably not going to do it by telling the truth all the time. They're probably not going to do it by watching out exclusively for the needs of the people around them, or primarily for the needs of the people around them. They're forced into a low trust environment where the assumption is already of very narrow selfishness, and where someone who wants to ally with them is probably going to also be looking for evidence of selfishness, not giving, because giving would be vulnerability. It would make their alliance vulnerable. If we imagine that our vaccine production companies and our federal government have pretty much the same culture as our prisons do, then it may be equally silly to imagine our vaccine producers to be totally frank as it is to ask a mental patient in a psych ward to be totally frank with the doctor who says they want to help them and is asking them whether they still believe, for instance, that the government might not be totally concerned for the well-being of their oppressed minority. I have a friend who was involuntarily committed not too long ago after the 50th anniversary of the assassination by the FBI of the head of the Black Panthers. And she was, agitated, thinking about this, ended up being questioned and being put in a mental institution for saying that it didn't seem to her that the government was on her people's side. And well, she's right, very, very straightforwardly right. And if you ask people to pretend that they believe that other people are on their side when they don't, and then to be altruistic, the only thing they can possibly do is try to keep their head down, cover their tracks, try to smash and grab and make confusion when they have an opportunity to, and build a pack. That can't actually get us out of the mess we're in.
All right, Sandrine, would you like to comment? And Sam and Ruth, feel free to unmute yourself and just chime in, and then we're going to have Ted with a question.
Yeah, it's really interesting, this perspective. I mean, I've been really intrigued. I mean, I'm originally Belgian. I'm now living in Brussels, have been for the last 30 years, but grew up in the States. And I actually believe that the vaccine culture in different parts of the world is very different. I think that the big labs definitely, and most of them are multinationals, are in a very competitive mind frame where they're going to try to make a profit. But if you look at some of the smaller labs and also the discussion that we're having in Belgium and in Europe, the whole conversation around innovation is very different. Our innovation and research department of the European Commission, believe you me, and I'm now the head of their new think tank, have just switched to 3 departments: people, planet, and prosperity. Where the hell else would you see this?
Anywhere in any marketing firm, in any finance company.
Only if it's marketing spiel. And this is where I don't agree with you, Michael. See, I don't agree that it's all marketing. I actually don't. I sincerely believe, I agree, maybe in a marketing firm where they're trying to bring this forward in their annual report and as part of their narrative. But actually, they are now thinking about totally shifting their departments and their innovation and their research around people, planet, and prosperity, which would then enable access to research and innovation for people first. The totally different mind frame. And that's the same thing that I'm trying to say here in the politics. We have lost sight of technology for people. I'm sorry, I think Palo Alto has gone down the tubes. I grew up in Palo Alto in the 60s and the 70s when it was the most liberal, wonderful place to grow up, where both psychology and IT were embraced. It now is the most expensive place. People are commuting for hours. People are homeless. I'm just appalled at how we've lost the plot.
Palo Alto is terrible.
Yeah.
It's terrible. But it's where people, planet, and prosperity comes from.
Yes, and I would also love to hear from Sam and Ruth in case you want to chime in, and then we have Ted with a question.
And I'd love to hear from everyone else.
Yes.
So in terms of risks of vaccines and some of the things that are particularly concerning me in the shorter run is sort of the exit scenarios for coronavirus, not just from lockdown, but when there are vaccines, how are they distributed, who do they reach, and also just the general effect of coronavirus in the developing world. I'm not yet sure there's a strategy that doesn't lead to mass disaster and potentially other disasters happening at the same time. There are current risks of serious food shortages. There's a plague of locusts. There's all sorts of dangers that could go wrong. And if it takes a long time to develop vaccines, if we don't scale up quickly, And if it's expensive and we don't distribute those to some of the world's poorest countries, then there's going to be like humanitarian tragedies, like beyond the UK and the US. Like there's the rest of the world, I think, has it potentially a lot worse. And in the longer run, I think the risks are more around international tension, like Russia's been mentioned. But there's also obviously like the China and America tensions going on and how that will develop. And it's unclear to me exactly what can be done in that. And I'm trying to talk to a number of people in China and think about collaborating on projects and sort of getting different groups to work together across those borders. But I think there are serious risks there. And the only other risk that came to mind on this sort of technology governance side of things is that we may see a big boom in biotech. And I don't think we've got the governance right yet. So I think that's a really important thing to be thinking about as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would 100% agree with that last point. I think synthetic biology is going to be a big push. And they've already coded the coronavirus. You can print it in a couple of hours for $1,000 if you want to. And there's really no pre-existing governance framework for synthetic biology. So I think I agree that's a big should be a big focus. I also think vaccine aside, just from a policy side of things, in emergency situations, there is a tendency to roll back privacy policy or surveillance policy in the need of societal good, and there's a proportionality perspective, but certainly in the US, very rarely are the policies reinstated that existed before the emergency. And we saw that post 9/11, and right now contact tracing is being used, facial recognition is being used, drones, thermal imaging, location trackers, and a lot of that data is being held by Silicon Valley tech companies. And there's really no pre-existing governance framework for it. So, I mean, the same technology that can trace a vaccine can trace people who attend the same protest or who write a blog or are in contact with people that are considered to be, enemies of the state. And I think that there is a proportionality side of things that we need to track and trace this virus, but the technology can and will be used for other means and by government. So I think that there has to be some kind of auditing of certainly the algorithms being used, and there has to be a third party that owns that data, so it's not being held in the hands of a powerful few.
Yeah, thanks. We had a few salons on from the Human Rights Foundation on authoritarianism and COVID, and then 3 contact tracing salons, I think, so far. And in every one of those, that was the main issue of discussion where people were also severely disagreeing on, like, how can we make this in a way that it's not kind of like a Trojan horse into continued surveillance. I want to give the floor to Ted Howard, who had a question here. I'm going to unmute you, Ted.
Thanks, Alison. Look, I was just wondering if anyone in these major institutions is actually asking the question about how scarcity-based value functions drive perverse outcomes in the presence of automated systems capable of delivering some form of universal abundance. And how do we implement systems that deliver abundance for all and ecological integrity? Like Kate Rayworth has got a small part of that question, but to me, she doesn't seem to look at the systemic basis that our market-based systems are based in scarcity, and you deliver abundance, they drop to zero. So is anyone looking at how we get past that fundamental trap?
Yeah, Ted, thank you for that question. And I don't know where you're based. Where are you based? New Zealand. I thought so. It's funny because I would have expected that coming out of the Silicon Valleyites that are on the phone, because this abundance conversation often comes out from the whole kind of IT, technology, optimization of AI will really help us with abundance. I think the first question, to be frank, is why do we need abundance? I prefer the word sufficiency. And I actually think that coming out of COVID, that's what we should be talking about. I already think that the mindset of abundance is the wrong mindset. We need to start to think about sufficiency as the panacea rather than abundance and continuous growth as the panacea.
Oh.
So sorry, let me just finish, because I'm having this conversation with many of our Club of Rome members, by the way, some of whom really believe in the abundance theory. I personally think let's first talk about how AI can really ensure optimization across the board, across our ecosystems and across our planetary systems. How can we better use AI and IT to ensure that actually people are serviced first? And then let's think about what makes the most sense in terms of a value-driven approach. And is it abundance or is it sufficiency?
All right, I want to give it up.
Can I just state, like, for me, that's a false dichotomy. For me, the two terms are identical. Like, I've run a software business for the last 37 years, and I trained as a biochemist. And looking at it as a biochemist, if you look at us as oxygen breathing entities, we have an abundance of oxygen in the atmosphere. We have a sufficiency. So it means the same thing. So long as there is enough to meet the essential needs of the system, that's abundance. Like, there's an abundance of oxygen. It's arguably the most valuable thing for all air breathing entities, and yet it has zero market value. And that's by definition because markets value scarcity. And it's when we deliver all the essentials of life to everyone in abundance in the way that oxygen is abundant, we have then empowered freedom. To me, that should be the systemic goal, but it's anathema to markets because it drops market value and then its profit to zero. So how do we get past that trap?
Thank you, Ted. And for now, we're at 59. I just want to be mindful of panelists' time. Can you go 3 minutes over for your final words? If so, then do this. Otherwise, we have to cut it out. Michael, okay, good. Then we do final words now, a minute each. Sandrine, Michael, Sam, and Ruth.
Yeah, just a quick, Ted, I think we should continue this offline because I think it's a problem of terminology. So I fully agree with you. And abundance has been hijacked by the growth movement. I really appreciate this conversation. And I think that we need to think of COVID as the first biggest live experiment that will enable us to think more systemically and come back to what's really important. And if we can ensure that policymakers, citizens, all stakeholders, our networks, start to understand that maybe we can really have a major shift in society.
All right, my next, I guess so.
Michael?
So basically, we're discovering that things that we took for granted work don't. I was very concerned about pandemics 20 years ago, but by 15 years ago, I'd be convinced that global public health worked well enough that this wasn't something I should worry about, and I spent my focus on nanotechnology and AI. And as I've moved my focus back here, it's because the failures of public health, which are not due to technological limitation, they're not due to not knowing what to do. People have been saying forever what to do. Obama was saying it 15 years ago, Bill Gates was saying it 15 years ago. We have the knowledge, we have the capabilities. What we're discovering is that the people who we entrusted with those capabilities are systematically incapable of fulfilling that trust and incapable of acknowledging their limitations, and that we're incapable of acknowledging their limitations. So basically no problems can be solved if you can't stop giving all of your trust to people who totally violate that trust. And no problems can be solved if you can't investigate violations of trust without blaming the people. What we need is a Truth and Reconciliation Commission on a global scale. We need to grant very general amnesty for all of the many people who've been flagrantly not doing their jobs, leading to this crisis, so that we can actually fix it next time.
Do you have a specific approach of how to do that? Like, if people want to...
I would actually reach out to the South African government. They have the most experience with trying to officially do that. I would actually task South Africa with advising, reach out to Denmark and a few other human rights leaders, and try to build a global COVID Truth and Reconciliation Commission that could perhaps give retirement at 20% over their salary to everyone who was involved in any public health agency, so long as they never work in public health again, but only provide advice to an entirely new group of people who, you know, can be trained from scratch.
Okay, again, another very not unambitious project. So I'll be following up afterwards with specific links. But Sam, I would love to hear from you as well.
Hi. Like I said before, I think if the only response of the world to the current coronavirus situation is to say, let's be better prepared for the next coronavirus and not have a broader response and a broader change, then I think that will be a disappointment. And I'm certainly doing a lot of work on what are the risks that we can plausibly prepare for, what governance looks like to have, what governance should there be in place to manage those risks. And I would encourage other people to think about what this ideal post-coronavirus world looks like, how it will function, start like developing those stories, those pictures of a better world, writing it up, working with other people thinking that far ahead, and start talking to the decision makers, or those people who are not quite decision makers now, but have the sort of time and capacity to listen. And let's see where we can get to.
Thank you. Ruth.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll keep it brief, knowing that we're over. I mean, I agree with Sam and everyone that we essentially now are rewriting the way that the world operates and cooperates. And I think there's a lot of potential within that reset that we're doing. And some of that will come with risk because it is going to be more heavily reliant on technology. So we'll exacerbate inequality, and if not done properly, will pose a lot of risk if technology is not deployed appropriately. So if anyone in the audience is interested in hearing more about that work on data or supply chains or anything I mentioned, AI regulation, ethics, feel free to reach out or look at the Fourth Industrial Revolution website. I'm happy to chat further.
Okay, man, we covered, I think, quite a lot. I would love to, after this salon, I'm going to collect follow-up links from all of you guys. And yeah, I'm hoping that we can follow up on the Slack, because it does seem like, for example, yesterday's panel, they requested a second panel, a follow-up panel, because you know, they were really just getting into the nits of it. So if anyone's interested in having a follow-up discussion, also let me know, and I'm happy to schedule them. Yeah, 1 hour is like barely enough to scratch the surface, but at least we have ideas out in the open now. Okay, well, I can't thank you enough for I think for your work and for your time of coming on here despite the workload. I think we really tackle everything from, like, how can we avoid potential arms races between China and the US and other nations that could be exacerbated by the current kind of, like, let's say, more adversarial dynamics that we see, to really very specific currently ongoing projects in prison reform, and using those as a Trojan horse to kind of like have more large scale effect on a national level. So I really applaud kind of like the breadth and depth that we went through in this 1 hour. I'm hoping that we can continue the conversation on Slack after this. I want to thank you all again for your time, and I'll be passing it on now to Lou, who will be doing more participant-based sharing. So this is definitely the time when all of you, who have been joining, on a daily basis, can kind of like get to know each other and talk a little bit more lighter than what is at stake for the world. We are tomorrow going to continue the discussion on how can we create more resilient global systems, and I think some of the more international stuff that has come up here we will tackle again tomorrow in a pretty structured manner, and we're going to talk mostly about global catastrophic and existential risk there. Okay, well, this is it from me. I can't thank you enough again, and I'll be handing over to Lou now, and perhaps let's continue the conversation if it's useful.
Thanks, everyone.